Good morning, church. Sorry. My name is Susie. I'm on the Global Justice team, and I'm really excited to be able to introduce Monica Frinifrock. She's a former member of Evergreen Covenant Church and now lives in southern Arizona with her husband, Jake, and their 3 children. And she's been married to Jake for 28 years, and they served 17 years together out on the field in Kenya and in southern China. And she was involved in healthcare as a healthcare educator and also a literacy advocate. So today, now she serves with Free Wheelchair Mission as on the development team and has led wheelchair distributions on trips to Dominican Republic and to Kenya. And as you'll hear today, Monica is deeply passionate about global justice and mental health, especially after witnessing firsthand the challenges that often come with life and service across different cultures. And so we're grateful to have her here to share from her experience. Please join me in welcoming Monica.
Good morning. So great to be back here. It's always special to come back to Mercer Island, actually. This is where we kind of transitioned out of overseas mission work to the States after many, many years overseas. And we attended Evergreen Church here for a while before we moved to southern Arizona. This is where our children went to American public school for the first time. This is where we returned to our jobs or careers that we had many, many years before. And it was a really special place to land, I'll say. So this is a special community for us. But like I said, we live in southern Arizona now. I'm sorry I didn't bring any sunshine with me. But there is a piece of good news. I have no Pastor Michael dad jokes for you today. I'm sorry, Michael, if you're listening. Like Susie said, I work for Free Wheelchair Mission now. I've been working with Free Wheelchair Mission for about 3 years. And I had the wonderful privilege of leading a team from Encounter Church to the Dominican Republic this last March. And if any of you have been on a short-term mission trip, it's really wonderful. And I just have to say, those van rides, if you've ever been on a van ride on a short-term mission trip, I think you know what I'm talking about. It's hot. You're all jammed into a van. It's on bumpy roads. It's stuffy. You're getting to know each other better. And it was on one of those van rides that Pastor Michael and I got to chatting as we were going from place to place delivering wheelchairs. And we started talking about missions and global justice, about cross-cultural workers and mental health and how we care for the workers that are sent out from Encounter Church that are really an extension of this body. And so he asked me to talk with all of you today about my story. And I was like, well, which part of my story do I even share? I've lived in all these different places. I feel like I've lived all these different kind of lives, and I've done these different things. Which part do I talk about? And he said the hard things, the hard stuff. That's what we need to hear. Like, what's it really like? And honestly, my life has been so full of different twists and turns, moments that I look back on and I'm like, did I even do that? Did that even really happen? I've lived in different countries. I've learned and spoken different languages, raised my kids across continents, and learned to adapt to contexts that once felt really foreign, but then, became like home. And when you're doing cross-cultural work, when you're doing global justice work, you start bending and shaping and changing in ways so that you fit in to the environment you're working in. I like to kind of say that cross-cultural workers shapeshift. We have these like special superpowers that allow us to adapt in different cultures so that we can be all things to all people. And even when I came back
to the Seattle area and started working at Seattle Pacific University as a clinical nursing instructor, and then at the International Cultural Health Service Clinic in the International District. Patients would walk in, they would look at me and they'd be like, I need a translator. And I'm like, 没关系，我会讲中文. And they're like, what? And, all of a sudden, I'm not the person they thought I was. I was somebody that they could relate to, and all of a sudden the chest pain went away and the earaches went away, and they're like, where did you learn your Mandarin? And so even those things still happen to me now, where those little cross-cultural superpowers show themselves or manifest. There's so many wonderful things that go along with working in missions and cross-cultural work, but it can actually be really lonely. It can be really frustrating, and at times it can be deeply, deeply discouraging. We rarely talk about that, though. We don't talk about the emotional and mental and spiritual costs that cross-cultural workers carry when they stand in a church service and they sing, "Send me, I'll go anywhere." They don't talk about what happens next. Cross-cultural workers experience burnout, depression, anxiety, persecution, PTSD from various kinds of trauma, and they often feel like they can't speak openly about that. They often overlook the weight of the struggle to share the victories. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. I'm going to talk to you about the emotional and mental health challenges that cross-cultural workers face and how the church can come alongside them with compassion and care. A few weeks ago, Pastor Michael, in introducing the Global Justice series, talked about the 1040 window, unreached people groups, and he talked about spiritual and social and economic poverty. And then he shared some really interesting statistics. He shared that only 3% of the total cross-cultural worker force is going to World C. And if you remember, World C is 29% of the world who have never heard the name of Jesus, who have no access to the gospel or a fellowship or church or believers or scripture in their own language that they can hear or read. That's my part of the world. That was the part of the world that I know really well, and that was our home for a time. We lived among people who never had heard the name of Jesus. Nothing. There were no scriptures in their language. There were no people that they could safely meet with, and the very few believers that might be scattered around, it was even dangerous for them to meet together. So for nearly 18 years, my husband and I lived and worked overseas in some of those really remote and extreme places, I'll say. We experienced all kinds of injustice. We witnessed the spiritual, social, and economic poverty that we talk about in global justice. It was in those settings that we raised our children, that we tended our marriage, led teams, and worked to advocate and empower the incredible communities that the Lord sent us to. It was a very rich and purposeful life, but it was very hard. And over time, my passion for ministry began to dim. It was crowded out by exhaustion, self-doubt, just feelings of insecurity, and am I enough? If I were to take a break, who would take my place? And all of those things were going on inside of me, while on the outside, the things I was doing were admirable. They were serving and ministry and things that people would have said, wow, that's so great. But I was really terrified to admit the areas that I was struggling in, and I didn't want to disappoint our church. I didn't want to disappoint God or anyone else. So today, I'm going to talk about that. So get ready. This is not going to be the easiest thing you've ever heard about what it's like to support a cross-cultural worker. I really wish what I could do is just share the highlight reels of those 17 years, like all the highs and the victories and the successes and the things that people read about or hear about on a cross-cultural worker's blog or in a newsletter. But the story that God and Pastor Michael asked me to share today is a much harder one. So my husband and I, just for some background, we had grown up in churches that we had a big focus on missions and global justice, and that kind of was influential in our lives. Separately, and then later together as a couple, we decided that we wanted to serve overseas, particularly among an unreached people group, using our skill sets and our gifting. After we married, we lived in California for a few years, and I worked as a nurse. He was a teacher. And then we joined a missions organization that focuses on linguistics and community development and literacy. So with our backgrounds, me as a nurse and him with expertise in bilingual education and mother tongue literacy, we asked the Lord to just take us wherever. We said that, we sang that, send me, I'll go anywhere. And so we did. We took an assignment in Kenya for 3 years where we lived in a really remote and kind of marginalized people group. But it was a very open environment. The people there had been Christians for a long time, but the scriptures had just been newly translated into their language. And so we were part of a national team that taught transition literacy and worked with schools and in churches so that the scriptures in their language would become more familiar with them. People knew how to read in their language and teach in their language. And I know that sounds a little bit strange, but it's actually a really important thing that people can transmit the gospel in their own language. So even though it was a really tough place to live physically, we had no running water, no electricity, there were lots of dangerous animals and insects. We got malaria. I mean, this is all the stuff that people are excited to hear about, like, what was it like? And we crossed hippo-infested rivers to go to literacy workshops, which is true. And, we had malaria like 15 times. Those are the cool things, I guess, but they're really not. But actually, we were surrounded by an amazing community of believers. And so it was a very energizing and lively spiritual experience for us to work alongside these wonderful Tharaka men and women, even though it was really tough physically. The 3-year assignment went by really fast, and we came back to the South Puget Sound, where I'm from originally, to meet with our church, our main sending church, and figure out what we were going to do next. I was also pregnant with our first child. So in that 1 year that we came back and were in the States, we traveled all over the country, speaking at different churches, sleeping in different people's homes, multiple states, reporting on Kenya. We had a baby. We started learning Mandarin. We started figuring things out, packed up our bags, and left. And it wasn't as easy as that sounds, actually. It was a really tough time for my husband and I because we had had such this amazing kind of isolated experience in Kenya. Coming back was really, really hard. And then we had a kid, and all of a sudden I was a mom. I was like, now what do I do? How does that look overseas? And also, it was also a very traumatic birth. And so I was really struggling with my own healing physically and emotionally through that. And as a nurse, right away, I recognized I was having symptoms of pretty severe postpartum depression. Despite that, I was like, can't wait to go back. Where are we going next? And so with our church and our missions organization, we accepted probably the assignment we shouldn't have, but God had a plan. And we decided to accept a very highly sensitive project in Southern Asia. And so, I was nervous about it, but I was like, I can do this, and I'll probably be feeling better when I'm over on the other side of the ocean. I had such a great experience in Kenya. I'm sure it'll be fine where we're headed to next. And so we were asked to go to an unreached people group and start our life there. And so we did. We left with our little infant son and landed in a massive city in southern China where we would be learning Chinese for 2 years, Mandarin. And I was exhausted. I felt so alone. There were very few foreigners around. And I just kept telling myself, it's going to be okay. I'm going to be, see, I was okay. I was totally fine. And no, I wasn't fine. I was really struggling. The language was really hard. My husband and I had different kind of visa situations, and so we kind of had to take turns with our language learning. The culture was unfamiliar. I went from living in this community in Kenya, this collective society into a totally different setting in a big Chinese city. I was breaking inside, and my passion for ministry just seemed to fizzle. It was like I didn't even know what to do with myself. I was so lonely. I had so many fears, so many doubts, and I was like, why is this happening? And I knew that so much of this was triggered from the birth of our son and changing, going from country to country and just entering into brand new motherhood. But it really got bad. And this was at the point where I couldn't get out of bed. I was crying all the time. And I remember there was a time I was standing in my little 5th-story kitchen looking out the window, and there were bars on all the windows. And I just thought to myself, if those weren't there, and that just stunned me. Missionaries don't think that way. Christians don't think that way. And terror overwhelmed me at those thoughts that were invading my mind. So I stayed quiet. I didn't want anyone to know. But obviously, being married, my husband could tell there were some things going on. And so we talked and we prayed, and he's like, let's go get help. Let's take care of you. And I was the one who was like, no, I'm good. I will be okay. This is all just going to get better. I just got to learn more of the language, and then I can make more friends. And I kept telling myself and trying to convince him that I didn't need to talk to anybody about it, because I was so afraid I would be judged, that people would be like, what's wrong with you? You're doing what God's called you to do. Aren't you enjoying that? No, it was really tough. I finally did have the opportunity to meet with someone who was able to offer me a path forward in getting the help I needed. And that's not really the story that I'm going to share with you today. I'm not going to talk about that recovery part. And eventually I did come out of that very dark season. And then within a few years, we moved to the area that we had been asked to live and work in. And that's where we were for another 7 years. And it was a very powerful time. It was also a very difficult time because of the security issues around it. And there were very few believers among this people group of about 2 million. And we couldn't necessarily even meet together because it was too dangerous to do so. So in all of that, my kids were totally oblivious. My daughter Chloe is here today. She could tell you she had no clue what was going on. But it was we always felt under pressure. We always felt like, we were being watched. We always felt like, okay, we have to put on we had to just make sure we were okay, that we were letting everybody know we were okay. And I take responsibility for not communicating my struggles. And I didn't know that was something I could even do. I didn't know that there were resources for me. And my story is just one of many. There's a growing number of cross-cultural workers who share that they experience burnout, depression, anxiety, but don't feel like they can talk about it. And research actually shows us that missionary stress levels are 2 to 3 times higher than the average American. Why? Well, constant transitions. You're learning a new language. You're relocating. When the time we lived in China, we moved 3 times. You're building relationships. You're navigating team dynamics. There's all kinds of expectations that you might feel, pressure from a church or from a sending organization, or even internally, that can cause chronic stress. And then you have isolation. Of course, we knew when we were choosing to go to these places that it would be isolated, that it would be hard, that we'd have to really be leaning into each other. But that doesn't mean we didn't feel lonely or felt like the world was passing us by. And of course, there's cultural pressure and spiritual opposition. Cross-cultural workers face all kinds of cultural misunderstandings and pressure to perform, and it's just really weighty. And then a lot of times you just want to do a good job, obviously. You want people to be like, we're investing in you, and you're saying yes, and we're doing this, and we're doing that. But then kind of comes along this fear of failure. Like, what if I don't do all the things that I set out to do? What if this doesn't happen? And so you internalize those setbacks, and you kind of blame yourself. It was interesting, a couple weeks ago, Bak Youssef from Indonesia was sharing with Michael how his first 8 years doing the ministry there among the Sudanese, they only had 2 converts in 8 years, and how discouraged and frustrating that was and disappointed it was for him. But he kept moving forward. So a lot of people, like me at the time, don't reach out. They don't share those struggles because they're actually worried that people would judge them, that if they're honest about their emotional health, they'll lose support, they maybe will be seen as unfit for the field, or they'll even be asked to leave. And so it kind of creates this tension, this disconnect between the senders and the people who go, where the senders don't really know what's happening with the goer because the goer isn't necessarily saying, here's the really hard stuff. They're just sharing kind of the highlight reels, like I talked about earlier. So in trying to understand this disconnect, both the nature of it and what can be done about it, an organization called Global Trellis conducted an anonymous survey back in January to look at issues cross-cultural workers face and are dealing with in their contexts. They asked cross-cultural workers what they would never tell their supporters or organizations because it might jeopardize their place on the field. I'm going to say that one more time. Think about this. They asked cross-cultural workers what they would never tell their supporters or organizations because it might jeopardize their work on the field. Over 400 responses came in, and Global Trellis discovered the following areas here on the screen that cross-cultural workers would be hesitant to talk to their missions organization or their sending church about. And so you see things like debt and finance, politics, kids, marriage and singleness. But the biggest piece of the pie is mental and emotional health. Respondents described a range of self-reported mental health struggles: anxiety, depression, loneliness, PTSD from exposure to violence, assault, and even suicidal ideation. All of these things to me make sense, and any cross-cultural worker you would ask would say, yep. But why don't we say anything? Primarily because of the question, we're afraid it would jeopardize our place on the field. One respondent shared the following. They said, "We feel beloved, yet forgotten, supported, yet lonely, attached, but disconnected, spiritual, parched." That says a lot. So as Global Trellis reviewed these responses, the language and an image of a ministry pedestal emerged. And you may be familiar with this, and if you're not, that's okay too. But there's kind of this, at least in the church I grew up in, the missionaries were like the angels in heaven. They were the ones that were doing like the hard work that people were like, oh, I couldn't do that. And you kind of had these tiers of pedestals. And so, cross-cultural workers would hear, okay, you're my hero. What you're doing is amazing. I could never do that. We got that a lot because of the location where we live. People would say to us all the time, I could never do that. I could never do that. It kind of gives you this, you kind of internalize that as, all right, well, I better do this right. You internalize it as I've got to be superhuman. I'm this person of faith. In the meantime, you're just struggling the way everybody else is here and there. And so with that kind of idea of the pedestal on the sender side, they're kind of elevating. And on the goer side, they're like, I got to live up to that. We need to be superhuman. And so the humanity and the stakes are at odds with each other that the goers and the senders experience. And this is not necessarily anyone's fault. It's kind of just happened that way. And what we need to do is change that by understanding what cross-cultural workers really go through when they're doing their global justice work. And the cross-cultural workers need to be able to talk about the things that are hard, not just the good things. So first, what we can do is challenge the myth that strength means never struggling. That real strength includes vulnerability and honesty. And as a church, as Encounter, you get to model that. It starts with you and your relationships in your families, with the people you meet with one-on-one, in your life groups. Not just meeting to be like, oh yeah, this happened and it was great, it was great, it was great. But to really talk about the things that are tough. It's hard to talk about the things that are tough. And the Lord wants us to do that. That's how we become interdependent and indispensable with one another. So it kind of starts with the church, and then that will go out into the cross-cultural workers, the global justice workers that you have partnerships with that know that, okay, I can be this way with my sending church. And Scripture is so full of examples of God's servants being vulnerable and honest in their struggles. Take Elijah. He had this amazing victory in 1 Kings 19. You can read all about it. He had a great victory, and the Lord used him in a mighty way. Well, what does he do? He goes and he collapses under a broom tree and prays that he will die. That's pretty stark. But what happens? God doesn't come down on him. God doesn't rebuke him or punish him. God comes alongside Elijah and cares for him, providing him food and rest and presence in a whisper. And I think that's just such a beautiful image of how the church can be with their global justice workers, to provide that rest and to be a presence for them. And then take Paul, the Apostle Paul, who had journeys all throughout Asia Minor and was preaching and planting churches and facing all kinds of persecution. He's written all kinds of letters that you'll find in the Bible. And in 2 Corinthians, he writes to the Corinthian church and he says, "We were under great pressure, far beyond our ability to endure, so that we despaired for life itself." And I don't know about you, but I'm pretty sure I've never received an email or newsletter from a global justice worker where they just outright said, "I'm despairing for life itself. I just can't be here. This is tough. I just don't know if I can go on." I don't know if you've ever gotten that kind of message, but I know I haven't, and I know I certainly didn't send anything like that. But here we have a great example of the Apostle Paul being honest and sharing with the church what he was going through. And he did this, I think, so that the church could see God's power through weakness. And that's really a really beautiful thing. There's so many other examples. David pouring out his anguish in the Psalms, Esther being afraid to go to the king where she was in this foreign land. She goes to her uncle for encouragement. And then, of course, we have the example of Jesus, who grew tired, and he needed rest. Weakness is not disqualifying, and it's definitely the place where God's power shines the brightest, especially within a church. Galatians 6:2 calls us to carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. This is God's design for support and community, and caring for those who are an extension of you. And you may not know them, and they may not know you, but you're in partnership with them. And so being an extension, they need to be in community with you. We were not created to live in isolation. God designed us for interdependence, to know and be known, to love and be loved. If that doesn't ring a bell, then I will say this, what Pastor Michael recently taught on, is that God created us to find our fullest life in him. And he designed that life to be experienced most completely in deep, interdependent relationships. So as we think about how we care for cross-cultural workers, for our global justice workers, what does that look like practically for you as a church? Because I can stand up here and I can tell you the tough things that I went through and how I came through that and how God redeemed our situation with burnout and having to leave projects that we loved, how we had to leave the people that we loved. And I can tell you all those things. But what I want you to know is that you have a role and you have a way to come alongside the people that are an extension of this church. So just some practical steps. First that we'll talk about is just to normalize the struggle. And I talked about that a little bit earlier, but to make mental health just something we can talk about normally, whether it's in mission updates or in prayer updates, in conversations. We want to make honesty safe and not a punishment. We want to let people know that it's okay that they're having a tough time. It's okay if they're not loving every moment of this culture that they're living in that maybe feels really distant and foreign to them, even though they're in a community. We can provide safe spaces and practical help. And this is really important here, and that kind of goes along with the ongoing relational support of just coming alongside and letting those cross-cultural workers know that it's okay to take a break, that we value rest. Just some simple examples of this. When we had our daughter, she was born in northern Thailand, our church sent another global justice worker that they supported in Indonesia to come and be with us and take care of our kids so that we could take care of our newborn daughter. We've had teams come visit us when we lived overseas, and we had people adopt us. A life group adopted us and would send us care packages. And back in the day, I don't know if you remember Skype, but their kids would jump on Skype and they would Skype with our children and practice Bible verses or, pretend like they were playing together. Because we were so isolated and we didn't have that kind of community, Christian community. We had community, but it looked a lot different. And so there's just some neat ways that you can provide support too with, finding out what resources there are in countries nearby where people can get counseling or have a retreat. So writing, calling, asking real questions, and then encouraging rest are so important. And then you have your national global partners. So these are partnerships with, Nicholas Fund for Education, the Hindustani Church, the partnership in Indonesia with Free Wheelchair Mission. There's all of these partners who are actually, that's their home country, but they are like global justice workers in their own country. And oftentimes, they might be the only Christians in their own communities. They might not have a lot of people they can fellowship. They might not have community that even understands what they're doing and why they're doing it. And that can feel really lonely too. When we lived in China, we had the pleasure of working with local Christians who were not from the same people group. And they were supported by churches in Hong Kong or Singapore, and those churches in those other countries would make sure that those workers were also getting rest, that they could return home, that they could retreat. Even though they spoke the same language and they looked like the people there, they still needed to have that re-energizing experience of just being able, I can keep going because of the isolation. So there's a lot of ways that we can support our national partners with those short-term trips and getting to know them. I found one of the best ways to connect is to just share about yourself when they're sharing about themselves. I think a lot of times global workers, they feel like they always have to say the things. They always have to be the ones sharing their experiences. And to hear someone from home talking about their kid's soccer game or something they're struggling with at church or a difficult thing they're going through in their marriage, that actually makes everybody feel more human, I think, in those situations. And that can be done with local, national partners as well. And finally, when your global workers come for a visit or they come home for good, there's many ways that you can help them reconnect and find purpose and process in that transition. And Susie will talk about that in a minute. But don't just assume they're the same person they were when they left. People change, you change, so be curious and compassionate because reentry can be just as hard as the departure. I always say that we're really good at sending, we're really good at getting people excited about going. It's the coming back. It's the coming back that can be so hard. In between services, an older couple came and talked with me with tears in their eyes. And they said, "We're so glad you're talking about this." They had served for some years in Asia. And they were kind of trembling the way that I remember trembling when I first kind of heard people talking about mental health and missions. It's very real that people just don't talk about it. And so even this morning, to have another couple come to me and be like, "Our church never talked about this stuff." And it's so important. So I want to commend you and thank Michael for giving me the opportunity to share this with you, because going is important. God's heart for all nations. I'm all in. I'm still all in. I'm working with an amazing organization where we're distributing wheelchairs and meeting people's social and economic and spiritual poverty needs, and I love it, but it's really hard. We don't want to be foolish and think that it's not a tough thing to do. And so I would just encourage you today to think about all of these things and to think about how you want to walk with your global partners. And I'm going to ask you, will you commit to seeing, supporting, and standing with those from Encounter Church who are an extension of you, even in their struggles, even in their victories. Learn more about them. Grab one of these cards today, stick it up on your fridge, put it in your Bible, and make a point of every week sending them a text, sending them an email, get to know them. So as we close, I just want to invite Susie to come up and share some practical ways that you can help care for your global partners through prayer, connection, and community. Thank you.